think we are ready to start. So good morning and a very warm welcome back on behalf of the Scientific Advice Mechanism of the European Commission to day 2 of our conference on science advice under pressure. For those joining us today for the first time, my name is Jackie Davis, your Master of Ceremonies and moderator of the plenaries, as we continue to discuss the challenges of giving scientific advice under pressure through a series of panels and workshops. Yesterday, we began with eloquent reminders from Professors Eric Lombin and Antonio Loprieno of the importance of science for society and how vital it is to ensure that it can play that role effectively in an increasingly complex world. We identified some of the challenges that science advisors face, particularly since the dawn of social media, in dealing with the pressures and sometimes outright hostility that comes with advising on potentially controversial issues under the public spotlight. And we considered the relationship between government science advisors and policymakers and how to manage the potential tensions that might arise in a productive way. As part of that, we touched on some particular instances of advising on contentious issues. There was mentions and discussion of GM crops and assisted dying. And we then also touched on climate change and, of course, the challenges of the COVID pandemic. Today, we're going to focus more in our plenary sessions on those two topics. We'll have a panel in a moment on when science meets politics, the case of climate change, and later after the workshops on science advice in times of crisis, the case of COVID. They'll be interspersed with workshops where we delve deeper into some of the issues we're discussing. And then there'll be a closing session where we will try to pull the strands of all of this together. And we will hear from Jean-Éric Paquet, the Director General for Research and Innovation in the Commission. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get underway. If you want to join our discussion, and please do, you can ask questions or indeed make comments via Slido. You go into slido.com, hashtag 448. My only request is that you are as brief as possible so I can see at a glance what it is you want to know or what it is you want to say and relay it to our speakers. So please do engage. Lots of expertise in this room. We'd like to hear from you all. So, and the last thing, Twitter, if you'd like to tweet out about science advice under pressure, get that message about the importance of this issue out to the wider community, please use the hashtag SciAdvice22. So let us get underway, and I'd like to introduce our first panel with whom I'm going to discuss when science meets politics, the case of climate change. Delighted to welcome Professor Andrea Hinwood, Chief Scientist at the United Nations Environment Programme, and before that, she provided strategic advice to the Australian government on a wide range of environmental matters. So she's had experience at the national level and at the international level of this. Professor Virginia Murray, a public health doctor and head of global disaster risk reduction for the UK Health Security Agency, might be better known to many of you by its former title, Public Health England. And she has a huge amount of experience in advising on population level responses to acute and chronic chemical extreme events. Great to have you with us as well, Virginia. Joining us online, I hope, we have Professor Diana Ürge-Vorsatz, Director at the Centre for Climate Change and Sustainable Energy Policy at the Central European University, Hungary, and Vice Chair of the IPCC's Working Group 3, focusing on climate change mitigation. She's been the coordinating lead author for 2 past IPCC reports. Great to have you with us, Diana. Morning.
Thank you for allowing me to be online.
No problem at all. And Agnieszka Ason, who is independent energy lawyer and visiting research fellow at the University of Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. She has extensive experience in international energy disputes and that interaction between international domestic law and politics in climate change. Great to have you all with us. And I just want to dive straight in. On this issue, so later we'll be talking about COVID, which was a crisis that came from nowhere, as it were, and we had to react fast. On this issue, scientists have been urging action, talking about this for decades. And there has been hesitation, not as much progress. We keep hearing the warnings from IPCC reports, we're not doing enough. Andrea, just from your perspective, do you think that we can sort of reconcile this, the politics and the science, and get the action that we need without wanting to put it too dramatically in time to sort of save our planet? Can we do it?
Of course we can. I mean, we have the tools, we have the information, we have the science of the solutions. And I think the challenge for us is ensuring that we're at the table with our politicians, but also with a wide range of stakeholders. And I would say that as scientists, to some extent, we also need to change the conversation so that, in fact, our communication is quite clear with complex information, but making it tangible for those that are actually receiving it.
And you say complex. I mean, that it sounds easy. Let's make it clear. We were talking just before we started today about the role of people like yourselves who advise, and I was very struck that you see yourselves, as I understand it, as intermediaries in this discussion, providing that advice. I was picked up, ladies and gentlemen, yesterday by somebody who accused me when I said ministers, politicians like simple messages, saying, no, that's too populist an interpretation of it, but they do like clear messages. I want to come back a bit later on to how you make that translation. But for you, Virginia, can we do it? Why is it such a struggle when the science seems so clear to get the politicians to act?
I don't think that's true. If you think that the United Nations really only started looking at disasters in the 1990s, and we've had huge landmark agreements since then, and we got the 2015 landmark agreement, the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, we were able to really engage with the UN member states with the science and technology. In fact, in the Sendai Framework, when it was published, it has more science in it than any other UN landmark agreement, I'm told, and climate is there, along with disasters and all the actions we need to take. And it's the implementation of this which is now so exciting.
Implementation exciting, but also very challenging.
Tremendously challenging, but the commitment from the UN member states to help us do this, I think, is remarkable through the UN system. Okay. And it's been a real privilege to be part of that, sitting on the sidelines of those negotiations.
And I'd like to talk a little bit about how that works in practice in a moment. But Deanna, very good to have you with us, as I say. From your perspective, so an upbeat message there from Virginia. It is there. We have managed to get the debate in the right place. It's the implementation. Would you agree with that? How do you see the challenge?
I absolutely agree with that. If we consider that there has never been a world war, there has never been a massacre, there has never been a financial crisis that would have brought 140 heads of state under one roof, like the Paris Agreement. That, I think, really proves that even the highest level politicians understood that this is the biggest threat that has ever faced humanity. So I think we are there exactly from the perspective of science having made a major difference in understanding, making politics understand. But as my colleague said, implementation and simply putting this in practice is much more challenging than just understanding the science of this.
Agnieszka, would you agree? I mean, I was going to ask you all whether, and it's strange that one can ask this question, but in this area, are we talking about something where it's been a spectacular success? And what Diana was just saying, actually, and Virginia suggests, yes, it has, because you've managed to get it there. It's embedded in all our thinking, politicians recognize it. Or you could say, no, it's been a spectacular failure because IPCC reports tell us all the time we're not doing enough. How do you view it?
I think we are a very positive panel in terms of the beginning. So I would agree that we can do it in time to save the planet. But taking the perspective of the energy sector, the energy transition has accelerated. Ambitious emissions targets goals have been set, and various initiatives are underway in order to fulfill them. Those initiatives are science-based. There is a lot of science in them, as Virginia has said. And we've seen spectacular failures, we've seen spectacular success in terms of response, but generally I would argue that we are on the right path to a much more efficient and greener energy system. I would welcome your views and any questions you might have.
Thank you very much indeed. Just following up on that, Andrea, for you, would you put the emphasis on the success or on the failure side of things?
So I'm an optimist as well, and we have seen incredible success But I think the challenge for us is that we're simply not moving fast enough. So clearly, where we have so many entities requiring change, and change, as we all know, in organisations is really hard. If we're trying to do this at the global level, it's hard, and if we're trying to do it as fast as we can. So what we want is substantial change within the next 8 years in order to give us the time to plan and transition down the track. So if that's what you're trying to do and you're trying to push your politicians, that's the challenge ahead of us. And that's where we need to be at the table to talk about the solutions, to get those quick wins and to provide that advice on those quick wins.
I was going to ask, and Virginia, in terms of speeding it up, how do you see your role in this phase of the process? So the argument's been won, the knowledge is there, the recognition is there. What do you need to do now in terms of that advice to get that speed that we need?
Well, I think one of the comments that was made by Lara yesterday struck me as really important. Listen, hear, understand what the issues are. So one of the issues we discovered in the Sendai Framework Monitor was that many countries had real problems in reporting on the hazards. So hazard reporting became a massive issue. And the only way this could be resolved was to bring a massive scientific network together, which I had the great privilege of chairing for UNDRR and the International Science Council, to understand what the hazards are of the world and to see how everybody felt about them. And we did surveys, engagements, consultations. We reviewed all the UN glossaries, all the science glossaries we could find, and pulled this together into a list that we got agreed, and then to write the hazard information profiles for each of these hazards. What we have is now facilitated for the UN member states what the definitions of these hazards are so they can report them. Why does it matter? Well, climate change is a driver of these hazards. It's not a hazard. And it was trying to make sure that we understood how to explain this to our partners at the World Meteorological Organization, IPCC, UNFCCC, all our networks, to try and make sure that we had a globally agreed solution which fits for the Sendai Framework, the Paris Agreement, and the SDGs.
But that also that politicians can see the need to act now because of that clear link between climate change and those hazards. Diana, for you, and somebody is saying, Jacques, I don't have a surname in our audience, ministers like, and we talked about this yesterday, clear. Let's change the word simple that I used yesterday to clear messages. And science advice must express a degree of uncertainty on a given issue. How do you bring together the desire for simple, clear, and honest expression of uncertainty together? I mean, in this area, we know a lot more. We talk later about COVID and how we had to adapt to our changing knowledge. We know a lot more in this area, and your reports, IPCC reports, make it clear. But do you still see a challenge of uncertainties in certain areas? Or do you think here the science is so clear, we just need to make it clearer for politicians, as it were?
I think that's a very good point. And in this body, of course, we struggle with this the most, since our reports are good several thousands of pages, each of our reports. Nevertheless, what the policymakers need from this is really 2-3 pages of that. So how do you really simplify that thousands of pages of wisdom into such a succinct summary that is accessible and actionable by politicians? Nevertheless, I think here what really matters is the precautionary principle. We have enough knowledge to know that even despite all the many uncertainties, there is certainly, it makes a very good sense to act now, and on that the evidence is clear. I would think that the issue is more about the mismatch of timescales. Unfortunately, so it's not that much about the science, because it's the political system, decision-making systems, and also industrial and corporate decision-making systems simply cannot see longer than 2, 3, 4, at most 5 years. And that's very difficult. And in vain, we are trying to put on their plates solutions that work in the long term when they are really shooting themselves in the foot if they're really trying to think in the long term. So I think the solution from the science perspective that we actually need to engage much more the humanities, much more arts, much more the social sciences, because so far science, we really engage much more the natural sciences, engineering, at most economics, but understanding that none of these systems really decide based only on rationality, and we really see that from the COVID crisis. But we need to understand much more why people decide as they decide, and I think if we get these sciences equally to the table, I think we will be able to achieve better results.
It's an interesting paradox, because yesterday we talked about the timescales the other way round, how politics is fast moving and science answers questions that can take a very long time. Here, the science is saying move fast, here's the evidence, and it's the politicians who are finding it hard to move at the speed required. For you, Andrea, as we move forward, how do you see this challenge of simplicity or clarity of message? Are there areas here for you where there are uncertainties about what we need to do that need to be addressed?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that it is about the clarity of the options available, and those options must be considered in the context of a wide range of stakeholders and other scientific disciplines, because as I say, the science of climate change, the predictions, the options, we know all of that. However, how do you then get behaviour change and social change? Because it's hard to ask a mother who's taking her children to school to say, please use your car less, or to have some other option for how you might deal with materials in the home. So I think the message is making it tangible and also making it short, but with those variety of options available, because we have to consider the whole range of stakeholders, not just science to the politics. There's a whole lot in between.
Agnieszka?
I would agree. So the response is a multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary effort. And I like the catchword actionable. So science advice needs to be actionable here. There has to be a target, but there also needs to be a roadmap with clear milestones along the way. And as long as we are reaching those milestones, then we can be sure that we are on the right path.
Virginia, can I ask you a different question, which was actually raised by a member of our audience yesterday, but I kept it for today. And it was someone who was asking, how useful or damaging do you believe disruptive movements are, like, for example, Extinction Rebellion, which we've seen in a number of European countries, for example, gluing themselves to buildings, doing all sorts of things. Is that this sort of the activist scientists? We had a long discussion yesterday about lobbying and science advice, and a great plea for keeping the two separate. How do you see, so as in your job, how do you see that line between advice and lobbying? And do you see those disruptive movements as helpful in raising awareness or counterproductive?
Let me turn to our young scientists, people like Greta Thunberg. She has managed to bring a huge viewpoint, which I think is so important. What we have found is that so many young people are really concerned about climate and the impacts on their future. And we need to try and support them in a useful way. And some of these networks provide useful resources, but also frighten people. And I don't know the final answer. All I know is that our job is to bring the evidence that we have and to try and engage with it as much as we can. And if we were to think about the UK and the very fortunate request it had to chair the COP26 last year, which goes on to Egypt this year, to COP27, I thought there were some very strong messages where a lot of the young were engaged and other people who were concerned to try and deliver some of these issues. Andrea, I think you're right. We have to work with people locally. And I think one of the things that's come through in the UK very clearly is a lot of our local government systems have been declaring climate emergencies. And what they need is the evidence to try and know what to do. And if I can just go on for a second or two longer, I was very privileged to be part of one of the European Commission missions on climate change adaptation with societal transformation that will impact upon Horizon 2020 and some of the research funds there. And it was wonderful to be able to bring health and some of the systems that we use in health for societal transformation to be considered. And I think that was a real privilege that at last we're getting health included and behavioral change included, which is what you and I and all of us will have to do, and our families and everywhere else, as you've been talking about, Andrea, to try and take that forward. So it's bringing all those things together that I think are going to be so important, Jackie.
Yeah, thank you very much. Diana, for you, the activist scientist, a help or a hindrance? And how do you personally see that line between, or maybe in this area you think we don't need to draw a line between scientific advice and lobbying for action? Do we need to address it? And for you, if we do, where is that line?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm so glad you asked that. There was a recent survey by Nature about of the IPCC scientists what they think exactly of that question. And interestingly, 80% of my colleagues said that yes, scientists have a role beyond just serving their science. They do have to engage. Of course, there are very different ways of being able to engage, and not all of us are so fortunate as myself that I'm now invited to this panel and are able to be engaging directly with the highest level political spheres. So everyone has their own way of engaging. Actually, 40% of my colleagues, IPCC scientists, did say that activism is something that we also have to do. I'm not sure if I fully agree with that. I think first, it's the most important to try for us to go through the top down, so how we can actually influence the highest level policymakers, because we are policymaking that we are able to, but we have a multitude of other opportunities to engage through media, through education, but I also cannot completely disagree with some colleagues who, out of total desperation, if they do not have the chance to be able to use these routes for influence, that they in the end perhaps go out on the streets. But I think that's really the extreme. But we do see that 40% of IPCC scientists, for example, really reconsidered whether to have children. So when you have that level of desperation, I think certainly there are different ways how you react to that. But of course, the best is to use all these other channels that we all are talking about in this panel.
Absolutely. Agnieszka, for you, the line between advice and lobbying, or is it not a distinction you would make in this area?
So I'd say that the public influence is very important, but there needs to be information and science that will base it. So we see activists claiming that there should be an end to fossil fuels, for example. So that's a long-term goal, and that could be the end game model. But for the time being, we need fossil fuels in order to satisfy the global energy mix. And we can take initiatives and support clean energy investments. We can reduce the GHG emissions by the application of carbon reduction technologies. But this is a long process that will not lead to the end of fossil fuels in any short-term period of time. So there is very often simply a lack of information that is behind some of the activism that is related specifically to climate reduction targets in the energy sector.
And Andrea, for you, I'm thinking about this in terms of whether activist scientists or movements like Extinction Rebellion are a help. When you are communicating, advising governments in particular, but I'm also thinking the general public, do you think it is more productive as scientists to, if you like, you said earlier, focus on what we can do, the areas, giving examples of how to implement in a win-win sort of way? Whereas Extinction Rebellion, it's the clue is in the title. It's all about the Armageddon warning of what will happen if we don't. As an advisor to governments on the international level, which do you think is more productive, to focus on the positive win-wins or the stark warnings about what happens if you don't? And for you as well, where is that line between advice and lobbying?
So we need the diversity of voices. I absolutely applaud those voices and that we're able to hear them so clearly. But we really run a risk that when you are telling people about gloom and doom all the time, inaction takes place. Think about it, because it then becomes too hard. So I think really what we need to do is to start to say, we need to communicate. This is really problematic, and we're all here because we know it's problematic, right? Yeah. But I think we need to start talking about, okay, here are some solutions and here's how we can start to take action. Because if you start to take action, then also our activists are going to say, hey, hang on, this is actually working. We can actually go further. So I think we need to be communicating the message that we have a really challenging situation. But I absolutely think we need to say, and we have solutions and we are all part of it, and we need the diversity of voices, both those that really are saying, hey, planetary Earth, you're in big trouble, versus those who are actually putting their heads in the sand and saying, I don't want to change my way of operating. We need all those.
And do you see yourself, we talked earlier about your role as a bridge between the science and the politicians and the public. Do you see in that role as a bridge, you see yourself more as a lobbyist or more as an advisor? Or is that a distinction I shouldn't be making?
I don't know what I'd call myself. It's a good question. I'll have to think about it. Look, I think in some cases, from UNEP's point of view, we are advocating the science so that we achieve positive environmental change. So I do see myself as an advocate, but I also see that the only way I can do that is with good, solid science, including those uncertainties so that people are aware of what the plethora of views might be. And I liked the term that someone said yesterday where they said, we represent the consensus science. And I think that's actually what we're about. So in my view, if I'm presenting the science, I want to present the range of scientific views, not necessarily my own.
And just on the other side of that coin, so we've talked about the activist scientists campaigning for faster change, the climate skeptics, Virginia. How do you see your role in terms of countering that skepticisms that you find in certain sections, certainly of the public, but also indeed among some politicians, particularly in some countries around the world? What do you do in the face of that? What's the most effective approach?
Science. Absolutely science, Jackie, getting the evidence there. And one of the pieces of science I really wanted to bring out was the incredible work we did with IPCC on the special report on extreme events and disasters for adapting to climate change, for climate change adaptation. That really was an IPCC special report that made such a difference. And I can't tell you the privilege of being part of that program and being one of the coordinating lead authors for a chapter, and it really engaged the UN member states. And that was published in 2012, which helped drive the 2015 UN landmark agreements of the Sendai Framework, the SDGs, and the Paris Agreement. And it really captured the imagination of the UN member states because the science was so clear and really quite shocking. But it also, there were the solutions, Andrea, that I thought was so important in a lot of it, by effective planning and effective engagement with communities, how we could work to understand more about how we could deliver the science more effectively. So the answer, in my view, is let's get the science through the consensus approach, to be as clear as we can, and to share that in a useful way in partnership with our colleagues, be they policymakers at a high level or at a local level.
Agnieszka?
Yeah, absolutely. So clear and objective scientific advice that is needed for all the issues that are relevant to our discussion. Also building of legal and regulatory framework that is required in order to implement any emissions reductions or climate mitigation initiatives. So we are still in quite early stages for some of those questions. But again, I'll be positive in saying that we are on the right path.
Diana, for you, the key here in addressing the skeptics.
I absolutely agree with my colleagues that the science needs to be clear. Nevertheless, I believe the science is not enough here. I think there are very few issues on which the whole society will think exactly the same and agree with the importance of the issue to the same degree. So I think what we much more need is some of the solutions that have been already mentioned during this panel, is really finding the win-wins. So instead of really persuading, it's not everybody that has to care so much about science, and that's absolutely, about climate. And it's absolutely fine if they don't care that much for climate. But everybody cares, let's say, for paying less for the utility bills. Everybody cares for their better health. And if we know these, and if we find the solutions that forward also also these goals as well as climate change. For example, very low energy buildings, which also eliminate the need for, let's say, natural gas imports, and they also help a much better air quality. So as a result, a much better health, or better, more livable cities where you don't have to be stuck in traffic all the time, but instead you can walk and cycle to your kids to school, as was already mentioned, and be healthier and save a lot of time and have nature around you in the city. So if we find these solutions that advance the things that people do all care about, then I think we are better off than trying to persuade everyone that climate is the first thing that they should care about.
And Andrea, I mean, there was a discussion, we talked a lot yesterday about one of the pieces of advice that people had for science advisors broadly was when you're trying to defend yourself under pressure and so on, build coalitions and so on. When it comes to climate skepticism, the broad, vast majority of the scientific community agree. And yet you do see situations where people say, well, we need to put both media, for example, my old business, need to put both sides of the argument. So we must have a climate skeptic arguing against every time. And then other people say, no, because the weight of opinion, you're misrepresenting the weight of opinion. How do you deal with it? Because if you don't give them a voice, they'll say, you're shutting us down, you're not listening to alternative arguments. But if you give them a voice, it can be disproportionate to the number of scientists who agree with them. How do you address that?
Good question. I think you have to listen to dissenting voices, and you have to listen to them because you have to find out why they're dissenting. And I know from other situations, not climate change per se, is that sometimes when you've got that very angry lone voice, which is actually creating a lot of media attention because they're able to target a particular area, you have to find out why. And that's when you need to sit down and actually listen to that person to find out. And it might be that you're then able to provide that dissenting view in the media, but you're able to balance it because you actually understand that rationale.
And is that what you meant, Virginia? You talked about listening right at the beginning. Is that what you meant when you referred to that?
Very much so. I think our job is to listen and to understand in a way that we can interpret effectively so that we can provide some of the more important information that's needed. And one of the things about climate is that there are numerous networks of evidence, and there are huge numbers of different knowledge hubs, and trying to pull these together so that we have a clearer consensus of what we mean by the impacts of climate for our world on health, as I come from the health domain, is something that we really are beginning to think about very, very, very clearly. And to be a knowledge broker is really key.
A link to the skepticism. Dominic Leglou asked, and I'll come back to if you wanted, Andrea, how do you act with scientists who work for fossil fuel companies and are paid by them and therefore always minimize the problem? So when you said you have to sit down and understand, you also presumably have to know where they're coming from in the first place. Is there a, I mean, is the answer to expose, well, because they're paid by the companies, they would say that? Or is that a sort of too aggressive way of dealing with it?
I think it's really interesting. I know a lot of scientists who work in the fossil fuel industry, and they're scientists who work in the fossil fuel industry, and their personal views about climate change may not necessarily be those in the companies that they work with. They're part of the solution. If we actually think that we can't engage scientists from industry, the private sector and other entities, we won't solve this problem. So in my view, we have to engage a diverse range of voices and views so that we are actually able to then put in place the solutions.
Agnieszka, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, so we also have seen a major change in the policy and attitude of large corporations, including fossil fuel companies. They are changing their portfolio. They are increasingly selling their legacy oil and gas business. They are acquiring renewable energy portfolio. They are also investing in various carbon reduction technologies. And all those efforts are science-based, and all those efforts are very heavily promoted now. So there is also, let's say, an industry-driven push towards greener energy.
Just wanted to come back on our discussion about activist scientists and their role. And Diana, Jacek Kolanowski says, should we as evidence-based community connect more with the activists who already have a following? We mentioned Greta Thunberg earlier on. To provide them with science advice, make our data heard. Does there need to be more collaboration between the activist scientists with all the good and bad that it can bring? And are you doing it now? Should you do more of it?
I think that's also an excellent question, and also that relates to the previous question, to which I wanted to add that I think the IPC is really the success story of exactly that, being able to engage all of the voices around the table. And that has been I guess, one of the reasons for the success of the IPCC and why we have been able to be so influential. And there are a few other scientific domains where an institution alone has been so influential in influencing the scientific debate and the political debate for decades. And that the reason exactly that we do sit down with all. So yes, we have been criticized a lot that we do have the fossil fuel scientists also at the table from the fossil fuel companies, but at the same time, we also have exactly the activist scientists at the table. And that has been tremendously educative for all of us. And I very much agree with Andrea, we cannot solve this without having them equally at the table and listen to them. And when you listen to them and try to find a consensus solution, yes, it may actually be a consensus, so it may not be quite what each of us would perhaps want individually, but at the same time, then the result is something actionable that is going to be much more acceptable by the wide range of stakeholders and the broader communities. So I think, yes, it is really important to engage all of these ends of the spectrum as much as they can be involved.
Thank you. Andrea, I wanted to come back to the point you made at the beginning. You said, I think we need to change in some ways the communication. And I really want to come back to this, your role as a bridge, the role of any scientific advisor as a bridge. And I love the question from Francois saying, do we need more scientists to run for elections? I think when you talk about being a bridge, it's not being directly becoming the politicians yourself, but maybe you think are you tempted?
Well, actually, having been engaged in that process, there is a huge benefit when the minister's science advisors have a science background, because they are able to interpret that information. And I have had to be in a situation where a minister's got really frustrated because she doesn't understand the concept between concentration and load and whatever else. And there is a benefit in actually being able to sit there and explain that. But again, changing the conversation so that you are able to communicate complex information in a way that is accessible for the person who you're
So you're a bit like interpreters.
Yeah, I guess so.
You're taking the complex and making it clear and reducing the complexity in a difficult area. For you, Virginia, I'm going to say, I just love the question. It is true, of course, that if a minister has the science, it's easier. But if they don't, how do you see that bridging role? What's the key for you to succeeding? And this links to my really final question, which is about, and I'll throw it in at the same time to all of you, about a piece of advice for science advisors working in this area on how we can really get this message across, get this speeding up.
So I think one of the things that from the work that I've been doing with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has been this networking across all the different scientific networks within the United Nations and other science communities. And one of the things that I'd love to suggest, Andrea, is that we have a proper network of chief scientists across all the big UN agencies. That would be really powerful, because then we would build the consensus from your work to try and make sure we could interpret it to the ministers or whoever needs it, because we come from a global approach, which we would obviously need to localize to make it a national, even a local approach to try and deal with things. And I think that is an incredibly rich way forward. What we have are things like the wonderful science advisory mechanism here in Europe, but we also have other SAPIA and the International Science Council and other science networks that are so powerful in bringing our scientists together. But I'd love them to focus more on some of these climate issues and to bring in the health part of it as well, because health ultimately after COVID, we know is critical to how we manage things for the future.
Diana, do you have any advice, any thoughts for science advisors working in this area? I mean, we've talked about a lot of issues, a lot of different things. What would you highlight as most important if we are to succeed in getting that urgency of action and for this community to play their role to the full in that?
Thank you. I have two pieces of advice. First is knowledge co-production is critical. So, and what we are doing very much in the IPCC and in SAPEA and some as well, yes, work with the politicians from when you start your scientific work. Ask the questions together, and then you go and do your science, and then go back to them and ask, is that something you really wanted to know? And so work with them, so engage with them, so that it's not the ivory towers of the science that then tells the politicians what to do, but it's vice versa. Also, that this is an equal process. And the second advice would be to engage much more with social sciences and humanities. Still, very often there is the supremacy of natural sciences or engineering and economics versus these other fields of sciences. But I don't think we will be able to solve these things without a much stronger and equal participation of these other domains of science.
Thank you very much. Agnieszka, your advice?
Yeah, I would say clarity and consistency in explanation. We have a number of new concepts in the discussion. We have renewable sourced gas. We have responsibly sourced gas. We have a number of new renewable energy sources. We have new methodologies for quantification of GHG emissions. We have new GHG emissions mitigation efforts, carbon capture storage expanding, and other technologies. And there is still very little knowledge about some of those concepts that are very relevant in the context of reaching climate targets. So I would say clarity and consistency in advice.
Andrea.
So I agree with the comments of my esteemed colleagues, and so I'll add to it and say that I think that we need to provide accessible, i.e. accessible to the person receiving it. It's got to be tangible, i.e. felt, real, made tangible to the person. And I guess it's got to be achievable. So if you're putting something where there's no solution, how do you deal with that? You've got to start to talk about things that are achievable.
Just to follow up quickly before we end on that, because I think the biggest thing you hear argued by individuals is, well, yeah, but does it really make a difference if I, one person, sort my rubbish or walk instead of getting in my car? That sense of helplessness, Virginia, just as a final thought, how do you as scientists, as science advisors, overcome that sense? You even get it on a country level. Yeah, well, okay, if Belgium does all the right things, if China doesn't do the right things, then what's the point? How do you overcome that?
Because you have to care. And you need to mind, and you need to bring your scientist's best foot forward to engage with everybody. We need to engage at many levels, and that's the privilege of being a scientist. And working at all these different levels, we have an opportunity to try and achieve what might be needed by really effective, clear, appropriate listening to knowledge broking what they need.
And on that note, those of you in the room, would you please join me in thanking our panel very much indeed for a great discussion. And thank you to all of you online and in the room for your questions and comments. I couldn't get round to all of them, but we did touch on a number of them. We are going to move now to a series of parallel workshops on different aspects of science advice under pressure, delve into some of these topics in more detail. These workshops hosted by friends and partners of the scientific advice mechanism. You signed up, those of you here physically said which one you wanted to be in when you arrived here. You go upstairs and you will find signs pointing you in the right direction. We're on the first floor. For the online participants, could you go back to the lobby and click on the workshop of your choice? Just bear in mind, online participants, that you'll have to wait a couple of minutes because everyone who's in here has to physically get to their other rooms. So please do bear with us if you're online. We will be back with you. Then there'll be a coffee break, and then we'll come back. Change of timing on the original program. We're coming back at 11:50 for our final panel on COVID, and then for our closing session. So enjoy the workshops, and I'll see you back here at 11:50. Thanks very much.